Electromagnetic fields, or commonly shortened as EMF, is a very common thing to be measured when it comes to ghost hunting and things of the paranormal. So many ghost hunters have many devices, such as the K2 meter. They line their cases with these devices, and it's pretty much an established science for ghost hunting. And it seems to be the only certainty that ghost hunters have going their way. But what's the reality of it? There are many TV shows and many ghost hunters who online will suggest that ghosts are said to be made up of EMF. But what's the true source? And it was while watching the many array of shows online and on TV about paranormal investigations and ghosts in general that I finally had stopped and I'd asked myself, who decided ghosts were made up of EMF? And it was really only at the thought of this that I realized the initial source for this claim has never really been explained. Ghost hunters are always careful in their verbiage and say that ghosts are said to be made up of EMF, but where does that come from? And quite frankly, what does EMF even have to do with ghost hunting? So after asking around and finding that nobody generally knew where these things came from and where these claims came from, I decided to do a deep dive myself. And the things I found actually surprised me. In the year 1996, a girl who was only about 17 years old of age at the time was claiming she was receiving frequent visits by the Holy Spirit. This caught the attention of a couple of scientists at Laurentian University in Sudbury, Ontario, Canada. When they heard of these girls' claims, a specific neuroscientist by the name of Michael Persinger actually went to investigate the claims himself. He had found that a clock next to the 17-year-old's bed was generating electromagnetic pulses with waveforms that resembled those to trigger seizures in both humans and rats. He removed the clock, which then stopped the visitations entirely and the hallucinations, which were dubbed what they ended up being. To him, he was able to conclude that the high level of EMF was what was causing this girl to hallucinate. Michael Persinger actually has a history with EMF. About a decade prior, he was studying how electromagnetic stimulation of the frontal lobes can cause humans to hallucinate, to maybe hear and see things that were not necessarily there. He found further that electromagnetic stimulation of the frontal lobe specifically could induce feelings of nausea, anxiety, and general paranoia. Previous studies done in the 1980s that Michael Persinger had conducted would use a device called the God Helmet. Now, this would expose subjects to a controlled amount of EMF to stimulate the frontal lobes to further prove that the paranoia and the exposure to EMF would cause people to cite paranormal encounters and just hallucinate in general. But as the device was used, further conclusions showed that while EMF levels were high, hallucinations were possible. But when they were low, there were practically none. Actually, there were just none, period. Michael Persinger would only claim some success in this area because out of the general control group, only 80% show any sign of hallucination. The team at Uppsala University in Sweden would actually go further and claim that these studies that were done were reporting faulty claims, and they would challenge this general idea that EMF can make you hallucinate. And as they did more studying, they found that the original experimental protocol done by Michael Persinger had provoked suggestion and expectation amongst the subjects, which was the more likely cause of the hallucination and not EMF itself. There's even a separate hypothesis by Professor John Joe McFadden at the University of Surrey that states, the conscious mind consists of EMF, and that a field does not disintegrate when we die. The firing of electrical impulses along nerves in the brain is like a sort of alternating current system, but with more direction and cascade effects. Further studies would come along as time would go on. In 1998, an article titled Ghosting the Machine will appear in the Journal of the Society for Psychical Research. This specific scenario had a bunch of employees citing ghosts and apparitions all over this old factory in the UK. Further investigation and research showed that there was an infrasound frequency captured of around 18.9 Hz, which was said to be the cause of the hallucinations that multiple of these employees were seeing at that time. The general conclusion from Vic Tanny and Tony Lawrence was that it wasn't a haunted building at all. but just the right scenario for infrasound to cause people to think that they are seeing ghosts, when in reality they weren't. I'm bringing this up because I wanted to point out that yes, EMF is very different from infrasound, but the point being, even the healthiest person, under any scenario, can hallucinate, even when they think that what they're seeing in front of them is real. Your brain is very good at filling in gaps of things it doesn't quite understand, and so when it's manipulated in a way that you quite don't even understand, it can cause you to see and hear things that maybe are not even there. So EMF being a possible cause for hallucination, it's not completely a outrageous idea. But back to the general discussion of the video, EMF and its tie to the paranormal. Well, all these studies that I've just told you about had led to a general consensus of all the ghost hunters who were around at the time that there was a scientific tie between EMF and the paranormal. And I know what you're probably thinking to yourself, but everything I've just said doesn't tie the paranormal to EMF in any way. It's the fact that the scientists themselves were the ones making these claims that the paranormal researchers at the time took and they ate it up, because for the first time in recorded human history, there was a tie, a string, from science to the paranormal, and they held on to it. They established it as fact, and they almost developed a pseudoscience as the foundation of all paranormal research. And proof of this evolution can be seen in the actual equipment. Even today, things like the millimeter and the tri-field meter. They will line the cases of so many paranormal investigators, and for what? Because so many ghost hunters beforehand always would say ghosts are said to be. But nothing was ever definite. It's truly developed into this very long game of telephone where it's one small tie that led to a general explosion of misinformation. Like I said, the actual link is just that it was of interest to certain scientists. And it wasn't even necessarily to study the paranormal, but rather how your brain works. And if you look around, most of the ghost hunting equipment measures EMF and manipulates it in some way, shape, or form, causing different dials or lights on different devices to light up at any given moment. Given how desired evidence is for paranormal investigators, even the smallest trigger of any of these objects can be presented as evidence, even if a building is legitimately not even haunted. The wave-like nature EMF can travel can cause an anomaly in a place that has no other signs of EMF. Thus, that weird anomaly could be falsely shown as evidence. Ghost hunting as a whole didn't really truly get popular until the early 2000s when a show would debut on the Sci-Fi Channel called Ghost Hunters. This show would cause a boom in popularity that was then amplified to an enormous degree by Zach Bagans and Ghost Adventures. It was in these shows that a very impressionable and curious audience would start to watch as they would explain their tactics, why certain equipment was used, and even surface-level terminology to explain to the viewer what exactly they were doing. But while these audiences were watching, they probably had not the slightest clue that what they were being shown wasn't a science. They perceived it as fact, but everything was done by theory. And it was the curiosity of these audiences that would be so lost for answers, and any little thing that could come off as evidence was very satisfactory. I would know I was part of this audience, which is what led to me becoming a ghost hunter. And the relay would continue from these shows. Because once I started watching in 2011, I would do my best to mimic everything that I saw on TV. Everything from theatrics to experiments and other tactics I'm trying to reach out. Everything that I was doing was based on everything that I had seen on TV, because it was all we knew. There was nothing certain. Every book repeated the same sentiments that the guys on TV were doing, so there was nothing different. I never really questioned it because I always figured the people who had done the research were far more qualified to be setting these parameters more than I ever was. As I matured and as I got older, I grew more curious and I grew more open with the reality of the paranormal in the real world. Not to mention, as I've referenced in a previous video, psychology is one of the major factors that can lead to proving how valid something is to an audience, especially if they want it to be real. And these guys were masterminds of proving that what they were doing was real. But they needed a scientific foundation to stand on, and the only thing that they really had a tie to was EMF itself. I would watch these investigations, and if I'm being perfectly honest, I would psych myself out of doing more than I cared to admit. But that brings up another important point. You see, ghost hunting itself is a very, very scary thing for some people who at surface level only believe what they've seen on TV. Hollywood has done a great job at making things seem exaggerated and a bit more out of context than maybe an actual haunting would be. And it's because of that fear that's built, or if you don't believe, general boredom of walking around an abandoned building in the dark, more afraid of another human than what you could see on a camera, maybe. But the mind gets distracted, and so you're either not paying attention or you're fabricating things that maybe don't actually happen. But it's that general idea of being distracted while you're investigating. Because when you're distracted, you're not really investigating. To an extreme degree, it's like studying physics while actively riding a roller coaster, which I'll admit is a bit of an exaggeration, but to my point, the distraction is still there. Most people who have done their homework and let me rephrase that, people who have done their homework will say EMF is fact. And will speak in definites and say that it is one of the most important parts of a paranormal investigation. And this distracted state of mind will probably be just cause for people to not really look into too many things like EMF. If it's just a hobby for them, why wouldn't they believe the book that they bought or the TV show they watched? It's very easy to convince yourself that EMF is paranormal when you're getting these validated sources presented to you as if they are legitimate. But the unfortunate reality is, it just isn't. So generally speaking, the fact that most people are distracted when they're ghost hunting, or even the fact that they're just going based off of a game of telephone, really, it creates quite the recipe for a mostly unchecked and fabricated distribution of information. Every single ghost hunter that I've ever met outside of my own crew have never been able to explain to me the source of EMF. They'll talk about it and they'll have the tools, they'll explain it as fact, but no one ever really describes the scientific proof that led to these conclusions. And a lot of these people will walk into these haunted locations and they'll take measurements and they will receive readings and they perceive them as evidence, and they'll even present them as evidence. The funny thing about that is they shouldn't be using their readings as a consistent form of evidence. If anything, readings of EMF consistently throughout a haunted location should be taken into consideration for a likely possibility that hallucinations are happening. Take, for example, this guy right here, the ever-popular K2 meter. This is a really cheap way of getting a device that measures EMF. It even lights up. Cool stuff, right? So what is this? And what's the history behind it? What's the point of it? And why do people always go to this? It's a unique history that I found. It made its paranormal debut to the world in around the early 2000s. Grant Wilson of Ghost Hunters put it on the show and said it was specially calibrated for paranormal investigation. What that means exactly, I'm not entirely sure. I've never had the chance to ask what, if any, adjustments were made. But, nonetheless, showing this device led to multiple ghost hunters finding it online and then buying it and adding it to their arsenal. And because of this, a lot of ghost hunters don't know that this device is actually meant for electricians. Most ghost hunters bought this because they saw it on a TV show. But did you know that there is a company in Syracuse, New York, known as K2 Enterprises, and they've developed this, and much to my surprise, this isn't even called a K2 meter. It's called a safe range EMF detector. And the reason why that's surprising to me is I didn't even realize K2 was the company that made it, which is a very interesting history that often gets ignored. So, what's the point of this? What this was initially meant to do was just measure for faulty wiring in your house. K2 makes an array of devices such as, I believe there's one where they use high-pitched radio frequencies to deter, unruly dogs from undesired areas. And much to my surprise, I found that today this device is more marketed towards ghost hunters than it is electricians. And the reason being that this kind of tech has actually evolved. There's better and more accurate devices for electricians to use. But this device is dated tech. And really what that means is it's super plausible that false positives are a reason why you're getting a reading. That's why electricians don't even like it anymore, because it's dated tech. And yet, it's manufactured pretty much exactly the same as it was when it first came out. It hasn't necessarily been updated. Electromagnetic fields are truly everywhere in the universe. And all an EMF detector does is it just measures changes in the nearby electromagnetic fields. EMF meters detect fields of electrically charged objects, such as your microwave or your old television, and generally speaking, they're meant for diagnosing problems with power lines or electrical wiring or even shielding effectiveness. Electromagnetic fields are caused using alternating current and direct current, but with differing results. EMF meters are used to measure fields of alternating current specifically. In regards to studying the paranormal, there are two types of radiating electromagnetic emissions: ionizing and non-ionizing. The electromagnetic spectrum ranges from the ultra-short wavelength that are ionizing radiation and X-rays into the non-ionizing portion of the spectrum, such as visible light, radio waves, and finally into Earth's geomagnetic field. However, it should be noted that there is no scientific proof that links the paranormal with any of this. So the safe range is dated tech with better and more accurate ways to measure EMF for electricians. But the fact that this is dated tech is kind of what makes it desirable for ghost hunters. This device is prone to false positives, and like I stated previously, the biggest thing a ghost hunter wants to show is evidence. And if there's no light going off, or if there's no sound or apparition to show, a faulty reading is pretty much the go-to for a lot of ghost hunters. And even a device like this, yes, prone to false positives, can also easily be manipulated. You see, if I was to grab this tape measure, it has a magnetic tip on it. Now, magnets are something that you could get anywhere, and you can hide them in your hand easily and do what magnets do. Just play almost a toy, stick something to a fridge, or you can hide it in your hand and cause false positives on a device such as this. Or, if I was to power on this millimeter, it would even read the tape measure there too. And even if you wanted to go the honest route, if you didn't know any better, or if you were just someone who was trying to manipulate an audience, you could just hold a magnet in your hand, or if a wave just happened to pass by you, that could be shown as legitimate evidence, even though, like I just said, EMF travels in waves, and anomalies are 100% possible all the time. Not to mention, if people are trying to get rich quick or become famous, flashing lights are always a cool thing to show, that way an audience doesn't get bored. Not to mention that erratic EMFs are very common. These anomalous fields are very easy to come by, and it's not really hard to see why, given that they exist practically everywhere in the universe. However, this is all kind of like a snowball effect here. It's all coming to the general point that is the truth of the tie between EMF and the paranormal is that scientifically, there isn't one, and there never has been. It's a social idea that has evolved from scientists using EMF as a way to study why the brain is hallucinating. And then ghost hunters took that as a scientific tie and evolved it into what we see today. In a more harsh way of putting it, it's a pseudoscience that is based on nothing more than the spread of misinformation and the desire for evidence to be caught. To quote an article published in 2006 by Benjamin Radford of LiveScience.com, if a device could reliably determine the presence or absence of ghosts, then by definition ghosts would be proven to exist. Which, isn't that why we look? Because nobody's ever been able to prove its existence, or lack thereof. EMFs are everywhere, and they can cause hallucinations if they are in extreme levels. Plus, there's a multitude of studies that suggest that high exposure to EMF can affect the person's physiology and behavior, anything from feeling nauseous to paranoid, to even fabricating paranormal activity. In 2008, the Associated Press and Ipsos conducted a study that found roughly a third of Americans believe in the paranormal in some way, shape, or form. Though it was a generalized group and it couldn't really be the entirety of the United States, it wasn't in a census, it still goes to prove that, generally speaking, people are fascinated by the paranormal, and those who believe have every reason to. Look at everything you see online. And with everything you see, one of the biggest things that backs up all of this is the science of EMF. So does this mean ghosts aren't real? If one of the fundamentals of ghost hunting doesn't have a scientific tie truly, then what does that mean? Well, for now, it just means that we've wasted a lot of time using EMF as a valid source to back up paranormal encounters, when in reality, it just isn't. From my own personal experiences, I can say yes, the paranormal is real. I've had many ghostly encounters, many of which are on this channel. But that doesn't mean that EMF is a relation to any of it. Truthfully, I just think we don't know how to explain it yet. And I choose to think of it like this. When Isaac Newton discovered gravity, he didn't necessarily discover it, it was more so that he realized it. Gravity in physics had always existed. But when he watched the apple fall and the wind turn it, and when he saw that the apple didn't fall straight down because of centrifugal force, it was this mere observation that he was able to go and grab the apple and replicate the experiment. Thus, physics was born. And when it comes to the paranormal, I truly believe we just haven't had our apple falling moment yet. I've just established that it's not EMF. And though there are some interesting coincidences where EMF almost seems to interact with the person, there's still no scientific tie. Nothing's ever been able to nail it down. I do believe that our thinking is valid and that there is something to it. It's just, we don't know where to start yet. And I believe that once we know where to start, then the true investigating can begin.